Winter 1813. Europe no longer feared war, it feared what came after it. The roads of the continent had turned into scars, forests were stripped bare for firewood, villages stood abandoned beneath gray skies, rivers carried broken wagons, dead horses, and sometimes entire armies. And somewhere inside that frozen darkness, the last army of Napoleon Bonaparte kept marching. Not toward victory, not toward glory, but toward the slow death of an empire. Because empires rarely collapse all at once. They decay like dying stars, slowly, violently, and beautifully. At the beginning of the 19th century, Napoleon had seemed unstoppable. Kings trembled at the sound of French drums. Nations vanished from maps almost overnight. Young men crossed Europe carrying banners they believed would reshape history forever. And for a while, they were right. French armies moved faster than anyone thought possible. Entire coalitions collapsed in weeks. Austria fell, Prussia shattered. Europe watched in disbelief as one man from Corsica transformed himself into the ruler of half the continent. To millions, Napoleon was not merely a general, he was proof that destiny could be conquered. But there is something dangerous about men who become larger than reality. Eventually, people stop following the country and start following the myth. That was the true power of Napoleon, not artillery, not cavalry, belief. And belief can survive long after logic dies, especially in war. The soldiers of the Grande Armée marched through snow, hunger, and fire because they had been taught something terrifying, that history itself marched beside them. But history is cruel. It gives greatness with one hand and takes everything back with the other. The disaster in Russia had changed everything. Thousands froze where they stood. Horses collapsed by the roadsides. Men burned furniture, wagons, even their own flags, just to survive another night. Some soldiers woke beside campfires and discovered the men next to them had frozen solid before dawn. Others simply disappeared into the snow. No burial, no prayer, just silence. And still, Napoleon survived. That alone felt unnatural. To his enemies, it was infuriating. To his soldiers, it was almost supernatural. But survival is not victory, and Europe understood that now. For years, the kings of Europe had feared Napoleon like a storm that could not be stopped. But after Russia, something changed in the air. The illusion cracked. The emperor could bleed. And once fear disappears, revenge begins. Prussia rose first, then Austria, then Sweden, then Russia returned with a vengeance colder than winter itself. Suddenly, Europe was no longer fighting for territory. It was fighting for survival. Against France, against revolution, against the idea that one man could rewrite the world forever. Napoleon answered the only way he knew. He built another army. But this was no longer the legendary Grande Armée of Austerlitz. These were boys, teenagers, farmers, children wearing uniforms too large for their bodies. Veterans called them the Marie-Louises. Young recruits rushed into war before they were old enough to understand what war truly was. Some had never fired a musket. Others had never left their villages before marching toward Germany beneath imperial banners. And yet, when Napoleon rode past them, they still cheered. That was the tragedy of charisma. Even exhausted men wanted to believe, because belief felt warmer than reality.
The campaign of 1813 became a nightmare stretched across Europe. Every road led to another battlefield. Every victory felt temporary. Every village smelled of smoke.
And everywhere the French army marched, the same question followed them like a ghost. How long can an empire survive after destiny abandons it? Then came Leipzig, the Battle of Nations. More than 500,000 soldiers collided across muddy fields soaked with blood and rain. Cannons thundered so violently that witnesses claimed the earth itself seemed to shake. Smoke swallowed entire regiments. Men vanished into chaos before they even saw the enemy. French cavalry charged through gunfire, while artillery ripped holes through the battle. And everywhere the French army marched, the same question followed them like a ghost. How long can an empire survive after destiny abandons it? Then came Leipzig, the Battle of Nations. More than 500,000 soldiers collided across muddy fields soaked with blood and rain. Cannons thundered so violently that witnesses claimed the earth itself seemed to shake. Smoke swallowed entire regiments. Men vanished into chaos before they even saw the enemy. French cavalry charged through gunfire, while artillery ripped holes through the battlefield like explosions from another world. For 4 days, Europe burned. And somewhere inside that inferno, Napoleon began to understand the truth. His enemies no longer wanted peace. They wanted erasure. The old Europe had decided he could not be allowed to exist anymore. Not as emperor, not as conqueror, perhaps not even as memory. And for the first time in years, Napoleon looked tired. Not physically, spiritually, as if he could already feel history slipping away from him. Then came the bridge. As French forces retreated through Leipzig, panic spread through the streets. Soldiers flooded toward the only escape route across the river, and suddenly the bridge exploded too early. Thousands of French troops were trapped behind enemy lines. Some drowned trying to escape. Others fought until ammunition ran out. Many simply disappeared beneath the freezing water. One officer later described the scene as the death of an entire world, because that is what Leipzig truly was, not merely a battle, an ending. After Leipzig, the retreat became something darker. The army no longer marched like soldiers. It moved like survivors escaping the ruins of civilization itself. Roads became rivers of mud and bodies. Men fought over bread crusts. Starving soldiers cut meat from dead horses beside frozen ditches. Entire villages burned behind them, sometimes to deny shelter to the enemy, sometimes simply because desperate men had stopped caring. At night, campfires flickered across the snow like dying stars, and all around them echoed the sounds of collapse. Coughing, crying, boots dragging through ice, distant artillery somewhere beyond the darkness. Some soldiers deserted into forests. Others kept marching because they no longer remembered how to stop. That was the true horror of Napoleon's final army. It had become addicted to momentum. As long as they marched, they did not have to face reality. But reality was approaching from every direction. In 1814, Allied armies crossed into France itself. For the first time in centuries, foreign armies marched toward Paris. The impossible was happening. The empire was dying. And yet, Napoleon fought harder than ever, perhaps harder than he ever had before. The campaign of France became one of the most brilliant military performances in history. With exhausted troops and impossible odds, Napoleon struck enemy armies again and again with terrifying speed. One day he crushed a Russian column, the next he shattered Prussian forces, then vanished through snow-covered roads before the enemy could react. Even his enemies admired him, because there is something deeply tragic about genius at the edge of extinction. The closer Napoleon came to defeat, the more extraordinary he became. But brilliance cannot save an exhausted nation forever. France was tired. Its people were tired. Its soldiers were tired. Even his marshals began to lose faith. And once faith dies around a ruler, power collapses faster than armies. In Paris, fear spread through the streets like smoke. Church bells rang through cold rain. Rumors traveled faster than facts. Some claimed Napoleon would save the city. Others whispered that the emperor had already doomed them all. Meanwhile, Allied armies tightened their grip around the capital. The final collapse had begun. When Paris surrendered, something inside Napoleon finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like ice cracking beneath dark water. He had spent years convincing Europe that he was invincible. Now even France no longer believed it. His own marshals urged him to abdicate. Men who had followed him through Italy, Egypt, Austria, Russia, now begged him to let go. Imagine that moment, the most feared man in Europe sitting in silence while his empire vanished around him. No battle, no music, no cheering crowds, just exhaustion. History rarely shows us this side of greatness, the silence after power disappears. Because empires are loud when they rise, but frighteningly quiet when they die. Napoleon tried one last time to resist, but the machinery of history had already moved beyond him. The emperor signed his abdication papers, ink scratched across parchment beneath candlelight, and with that single signature, an era ended. They sent him to Elba, a tiny island in the Mediterranean, a prison for a man who once ruled most of Europe. And for a brief moment, the continent exhaled. The war was over. The nightmare had ended. Or so they believed. But legends are difficult to bury, especially legends built from ambition, glory, and fear. Across France, old veterans still kept their uniforms hidden away. Some secretly polished medals beside fireplaces late at night. Others told children stories about impossible victories beneath golden imperial banners. Because Napoleon was no longer merely a person, he had become memory, and memory is often more powerful than reality. That is why the last army of Napoleon still matters today, not because it won, not because it survived, but because it revealed something timeless about humanity. People will endure unbearable suffering for ideas they believe give meaning to their lives, even when those ideas are collapsing around them, even when the dream has already died. The soldiers of Napoleon marched through snowstorms, starvation, and destruction because they believed they were part of something eternal. And maybe that is the oldest tragedy in history. Civilizations fall, empires disappear, but human beings continue searching for figures larger than themselves. People to believe in, people to follow.
People to transform fear into purpose. Sometimes those figures build greatness. Sometimes they lead millions into catastrophe. Usually, they do both. Perhaps that is why Napoleon continues to fascinate the world centuries later. Because he embodied both sides of human ambition, the glory and the ruin, the dream and the graveyard waiting behind it. By the end, the last army of Napoleon was no longer fighting for France. It was fighting for memory itself, for the hope that all the suffering had meant something, for the belief that history could still turn backward. But history never moves backward. It only leaves echoes. And across Europe, those echoes still remain. In frozen battlefields beneath forests, in forgotten graves beneath fields of grass, in old paintings where young soldiers still march beneath imperial eagles
toward destinies they cannot yet understand. And maybe that is the final lesson of Napoleon's last army.